to the all right, well, it's been several weeks since we've been able to gather, so it's good to see everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us. And where we left off is we've been focusing our attention on, we spent all that time, of course, on the study part, the exegesis. And so the last several times that we've met, we've turned our attention to the exposition part, to the preparing the message to teach. And we've been focusing our attention most recently, the last time we gathered, on creating the sermon. So after you've done your study and determined the author's main point, the exegetical idea, oftentimes that's when many preachers will then just say, okay, now I'm ready to preach. And they'll go straight to doing the sermon or the teaching. But I think it's helpful to, a few things need to happen before that. One is just identifying those timeless truths. If you'll remember, those are the truths that the author bases his, what he says, that those timeless truths are what he applies to his hearers. And those are the things, the timeless truths, the doctrines, the truths that apply to all situations and all people. Those truths then are what we need to discover from what the author is saying, because it's those truths that we will communicate to our hearers. And so we must understand that. What was the author? What was he basing his teaching, his application on in what he wrote? Now, and then we also talked about the importance of, before focusing attention on others and your teaching and those things, is to focus attention on ourselves, that we should spend time thinking about and meditating upon the particular truths that we've been learning, that we should first consider, how does the passage apply to us before we think about how it should apply to others? So that was this step number 10, meditate on the passage. And I think that's a very important step that's often overlooked. Of course, we should be praying all through the process. That is certain. We need to be dependent at every step. But I think it's important to set a specific time aside just to give attention to, now that I've learned this passage, how does it apply to me? What are things I need to work on? What do I learn about God from this passage? What does it show me about Christ? Those kinds of things. And then we can turn our attention towards others. And that's what happens then when we go to the next step, which is generate a homiletical idea. So even at this point, it's good to think about ahead of time what the sermon's going to look like. All right. And the first step in that process is determining your main point that you want to communicate to your hearers. Now, of course, it will be based on the text. But for example, if you were in a passage in the Psalms, say, and the exegetical idea was something like David takes refuge in the Lord. All right, that's more of an exegetical idea. That is the truth from the passage, but you want to direct it then when you are ready to preach or to teach. You want to direct it to, if I could spell here, to your hearers. So you might say something like, you must take refuge in the Lord. Okay, something like that. So just again, the idea is it's the sermon, it's what you want to communicate to your hearers based upon what the author said and the timeless truths. Okay, so that's the difference between the exegetical idea and the homiletical idea. So we spent a lot of time on that, looked at some examples. You can go back in the previous sessions. And then from that point, that's the starting point for your sermon draft. Because again, remember, the homiletical idea is made up of the sermon main point, and the sermon outline. Okay, and so we talked about the importance of those, that the main point and the outline there were those 4 characteristics that we talked about, that they must be accurate, clear, directed, and memorable. Remember, those were the characteristics of the sermon main point and the outline points. That first, of course, our priority is accuracy. That's why we spent all that time and effort on the study, so that we could best understand with the direction of the Spirit as we are diligent to study, understand what the original author was saying. And then our priority as the teacher or the preacher is clarity. All right, we must study so that we understand, but then we must also explain clearly so that our hearers understand. All right, you have to have both, or you haven't accomplished your goal. If you're a preacher or a teacher, you must not only be accurate, that's of course a priority, but you must be clear. The people you're speaking to must understand. And yes, it is a work of the Spirit to bring that understanding, but the Spirit uses means. He uses people to communicate and teach his word. And so accuracy and clarity, those are the priorities. Now, those are non-negotiable, okay? However, if what you can do to even further improve your ability to communicate God's truth is to make your outline and main points directed. Remember, that's aim them at your hearers, like I showed you here. You must take refuge in the Lord. So that's important, to be able to have your hearers identify with how they need to respond, what they need to do. That's a helpful thing. And then also memorable. Memorable in the sense of sometimes make it as short as you can, and also maybe what I call striking, something that people can remember. So perhaps even improving upon this this homiletical, maybe take refuge in the Lord. Or, so I shortened it a little bit, or perhaps you could have it even shorter, take refuge, not shorter, I mean in the Redeemer. Notice using the word, our word at refuge and our word Redeemer. That might make it a little more memorable, all right? So, but we never want to sacrifice accuracy or clarity. All right, we wouldn't want to just say take refuge. Okay, that's not as clear. Take refuge where and what. And so it's shorter, much easier to remember, but it sacrifices the clarity a little bit. So again, that's why I said the first 2 priorities are to be accurate and clear. And then if you can, also be directed and memorable, but without sacrificing accuracy or clarity. All right, that's what is key. It's much better to have a main point outline, and even really this would apply to the whole message, but it's obviously accuracy and being clear are more important, most important in this whole process. Okay, this is just by way of review. And then we talked about, again, as you approach the sermon itself, again, accuracy and clarity are important. And then in addition to that, as you're thinking about putting your sermon together, it needs to be applicable. Again, really the idea of being directed to your hearers and what they need to do with it. Well, we're going to go into this in more detail in a few minutes. And then another objective as you put your sermon together is just to remember to be thinking about your conviction, passion, energy, communicating that it matters to you, which again, we'll get more in detail on that later. All right. And then we turned our attention to the structure of the sermon. And we talked about, again, just as I said a moment ago, the importance of accuracy, that you understand the text rightly. And also the goal of your exposition is clarity, that your hearers understand the text rightly and understand what what God is saying through that passage. All right. And that's why we've talked here about the structure of an expository sermon, because I believe if there's structure, it's easier for your hearers to follow you. Okay. There's no command in the Bible that says, thou must preach a sermon with these three, with this particular structure. But we do see, as we look at how Jesus taught, how the apostles taught, various sermons in the Bible, or teachings in Scripture, we do see that there is a structure typically to them. And so we have found over the centuries a typical structure, which makes it easier for people to follow you if they're going to sit and listen to you, is a sermon that has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. All right, these are the three primary elements in a typical expository sermon. And again, the structure helps to with this goal of clarity. All right, because if you have a sermon put together, and you can be speaking a lot of different things that are helpful, but sometimes if they're not connected, if there's no logical flow, if there's not a clear path or a structure, sometimes it might be harder for many people actually to follow. Some people are able to follow or are helped by just anything that is said. But there are a number of people that it's better for them if there's a structure and a clear guide and path in the sermon. So that's what we're talking about here, is just having structure is helpful in making a teaching that people can follow. Okay. Any questions so far? Hopefully this is just, I'm trying just to review, catch us up. It's been several weeks since we've been able to meet, but any questions so far on what I've been talking about? Or comments? Again, hopefully this shouldn't be anything new. Just I wanted to go over some of the ground that we covered together in recent sessions. Okay. So where we left off, we talked for a while about the introduction and the goal of the introduction, to get the attention of your hearers, introduce the theme, help those that you're speaking to identify with the need to be able to identify what is important in this passage, how does it connect to me, then to transition to the body of the sermon. And then we discussed in the body of the sermon, which really, again, the body is your sermon outline, basically. It's the focus of those outline points, which you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points in your sermon. And again, it's helpful just to have those points specifically and distinctly identified. And each of those points should contain the following elements. We called them the six P's of your sermon points, and that is the statement or point, proof, picture, persuasion, plan, and problem. We've covered the first 4 together already, where statement was just stating the outline point clearly. Again, so often I've heard sermons where the preacher has the outline point on his notes, so he knows it, but he doesn't say it explicitly. So it's helpful just to remember, state your point, the outline point, and then I would repeat that, not only state it at the beginning as you introduce it, but also say it again at the end as you move toward the next point. Again, that's helpful to keep the people who are listening to you, they can follow you. So they now know as you get to the end of the point and you say, so we have seen here first that we must take refuge in the Lord by praying to him each day, or whatever that point is. Now, secondly, the second way we take refuge in the Lord is to spend time in his word. And so now they know that, okay, we finished the first point about praying. Now we're moving our attention towards the second point, which is reading. So again, they can follow you clearly. And I think, as we talked about before, I think John MacArthur is one of the best at doing this kind of thing. It's easy to follow him because he does this. He'll repeat his previous point, and even points, if he's in a third or fourth point, he will often say, so the first way we see take refuge in the Lord is through prayer. Second way is through the word. A third way is through fellowship, or something like that. So again, it's helpful just to repeat those points, because it helps your people to track with you, to be able to follow you and to remember. All right. So that's the first, is the state the point. And the second P is the proof, or that is the explanation of the point. So here's where you're going to probably spend more of your time helping your hearers to see from the passage how you came up with that point. Where is that outline point found within the text? So this second P, or proof, is to explain, to show them from the passage. And this is where a lot of your study might come in, your word studies or some of those things. Again, remember, don't be technical. Don't make this a lecture. But it is helpful to show them so that they can, as you do that, they can then learn themselves. You know, as you explain a passage, you're actually helping people to learn how to study. Because as you show them what the important features are in the passage, as you might say, look, now the main statement here in this text is the command to take refuge. And so it helps as you do this with each and every sermon, people begin to learn what to look for and how to study, how to read the scripture. So this part is actually a very important, not only in you explaining the passage, but actually also it provides an example for others to learn how to study passage as well. And so in this particular part, this particular P of proof, it is again, the key here is showing how the point is derived or obtained from the passage. Okay, and there's a real skill in being able to do this without it being just sort of this technical lecture, which is not what you want to do. All right, as our brother Dwayne reminds us very often, we don't want to be boring. We want to be engaging and helpful. And so we need to be careful as we explain that we do it in such a way that is not overly academic, so to speak. All right. So using, this Greek word and talking about this grammatical term, and, don't do that very often. Once in a while, it's important and helpful, but don't overdo that part too much. All right. Okay. So that's explanation or proof. So we have the point, the proof. We also discussed the picture or the illustration. That is to present something the hearer is familiar with as you're explaining something within the passage for three reasons. One is, and a primary use of illustration is to clarify a particular truth. That is to help the hearers better understand it, to help them make a connection with something in their world that they can follow more easily. But also, I think illustrations can be very helpful in emphasizing a particular truth or in helping it to be memorable. Sometimes the point is clear, but when you add to it a story and illustration, that can help people that can help you to show the importance of that point, or it can be a way to help them remember the particular point as they connect it to an illustration that you have given them. All right. So illustrations are a very useful tool in preaching and trying to connect a principle from the text to the hearers a present world, something they can relate to. And then we see, you know, many examples from Jesus. And one that comes to my mind is, you know, when he talks about when your children ask for bread, you don't give them a stone, right? And that's really an illustration, because he's helping people see, you know, as he's talking about the Father's love for us, he uses an illustration of a human father. And if their child asks for bread, a human father who loves his child would not just throw a stone, you know, here, eat this. Jesus says no. And so that we make a connection there. It's like, oh yeah, that's a picture of a father's love for his child. And then Jesus was describing God's care and love for us, using that as an illustration. So it helps make a connection there. And in that case, an emotional connection. I remember when I first became a dad, we had our first child, and I remember listening to a sermon, and the preacher brought up that was in that passage. I think it was in Matthew. And I just remember how that really made a connection to me as a father with now having this child. Like, oh, wow. So I understood better God's love through the illustration Jesus used, because that was now part of an experience I had. And so it wasn't just that it helped me understand the truth better, but I think it helped me to identify better with God's love, because now I had this experience in my life of a child and my love for my child. And so we see Jesus use illustrations quite often to help his hearers make those connections better and understand better. That's what parables are, right? Really, they're an illustration of a particular truth that he wants to communicate. And so he does it in the form of a story, which, by the way, is, you know, stories are very effective illustrations because they're easy to remember. People can identify with them. And so Jesus often used parables or stories to illustrate particular truths. And so that's something, again, for us to learn from, is don't just state the point and explain it. Certainly that's necessary, but also consider ways to help your hearers better understand it or identify with it or remember it by using illustrations. Okay. And we talked about various sources of illustrations. If you go back in those previous sessions, when we talked about illustration, and just ways you can find illustrations and what are helpful illustrations to use, things like that. Okay. All right. So that's the picture, point proof picture. Any questions or comments before I keep going? I want to make sure to give you opportunity if you had some thoughts or comments or questions. Anybody? A lot of times too, as I think about it, if you can use other passages or stories from the Bible as your illustration, that's the most effective, most helpful as well. So keep that in mind also as you think about illustrations. Is there any other passage in Scripture that I could use to illustrate this particular point that I'm making? That's helpful too, because one, it gives opportunity to look at another portion of Scripture as well, and including that within your message. Anybody have any questions?
It's awfully important that you learn something yourself from it, and
yes.
Maybe share that. I mean, if you ain't learned nothing, probably they're not going to learn nothing. But if you've taught yourself first and you've been thrilled by what you see and what you've learned, that might put a little fire into it and put a little bit of energy behind it. That's awfully important to be sure that we get the message first and apply it to our own hearts, and that we get excited about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's really part of why that meditation step is so important. That's self-reflection upon the passage. Because yeah, if this is just something, some piece of information, that we are communicating, there's not going to be that fire or passion or energy or emphasis that is a key part of communicating God's truth. And I think even in illustrations, that can come out as well. As you tell a story or something like that, with that can help to bring that energy into your message at that point. But yeah, good point. Okay. Thank you. Let's look at the next one. Remember it again. Sorry, this is still by way of review. Just wanted to go over a few of these things. The argumentation, or the fourth P, is persuasion. And remember, in this step, again, explanation, that gives the point of the passage. That's the teaching. Argumentation tells why the passage matters. And this would actually be part of what Dwayne just brought up about the passion, energy, the conviction. This is where argumentation is so important. And again, by argumentation, we don't mean to argue, but the idea is to persuade your hearers to respond. The explanation part, the proof step here, is just to explain what the text means. The persuasion part here is to then seek to call that person to respond to that truth, to compel the hearers to apply it, to maybe ask questions to show them the importance of it, or ask questions to get them to think about, are they considering what this passage is saying to them, right? Again, a teacher merely explains the text, okay, which is important. We must do that. A preacher both explains and then compels the hearers to apply it, okay? So that's this element. This fourth P is persuasion. Are you doing anything as you're teaching this passage? Are you doing anything to encourage your hearers to respond, to believe and respond? All right, we see Jesus do that all the time. He didn't just communicate some information and then walk on. He would often ask questions or direct the people to consider what he was saying and to respond to it, right? What was the Sermon on the Mount, right? One of the greatest sermon preached on earth. And remember, at the end of the sermon, what did Jesus do? He used an illustration, right? He talked about the man who builds his house upon the rock and the man who builds his house upon the sand, right? You guys remember this? Let's just look at this for a minute. I think this is an important example for us. All right, let me see. Tangin, can you read verses 24 to 29? This is Matthew chapter 7.
Okay, Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 29. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. When Jesus has finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as their scribes.
Thank you. Okay, there's a lot here, but notice, one, how Jesus uses an illustration, a picture that they would identify with as he describes this man who builds his house upon the rock, right? And how many men does he describe? There's two here, right? There's a man who builds his house on a rock and a man who builds his house upon the sand. So he's using an everyday illustration to make a point, though. What's the point he's making? Actually, notice here his use of persuasion. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. What's he saying here? Not only hear my words, do something with them. Respond. Otherwise, you're like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. All right, so Jesus is, again, the masterful teacher. He combines an illustration here with persuasion. So once they see, oh yeah, what fool would build his house on sand? That's dumb. You know, you build your house on solid foundation. So Jesus says, yeah, that's right. So you're like that fool if you don't respond to what I'm teaching you. And then notice how it affected the people. When Jesus had finished, the crowds were amazed. Why were they amazed? He was teaching as one having authority, not as their scribes. Their scribes were lecturers. The scribes would just say, you know, explain a passage maybe, but talk about, you know, this, this rabbi says this, and it's just a lecture. Jesus would teach them as one with authority because he would call them to respond. Do something, respond to this. Hear these words and act on them. Apply them. If you don't, you're like the foolish man building his house on the sand. And so people are like, wow, he preaches with authority. He's telling me to do something with this. So I think this is a very important illustration or example of our Lord himself using this characteristic of persuasion. Certainly he taught, certainly he explained, he illustrated, used a lot of illustrations, but he also persuaded, he also compelled his hearers to respond. So we need to do the same. And that is this fourth P here of persuasion. Persuasion, okay? So keep that in mind. And really connected to persuasion is the fifth P, which is the plan. Right? The persuasion is the calling people to respond. The plan is to then help give them some specific ways, some ideas in how to apply the passage. So persuasion answers the question, so what? Why does this matter? Why is this important? Application answers the question, now what? Okay? So I need to listen to Jesus's words and respond to them. And then as I am the preacher, then I might give my hearers some examples or ideas in how to apply the passage in their own lives. Okay? Again, we must remember the author's intended meaning is the foundational hermeneutic, right, in this process of studying a passage. But remember, our role, our job as the teacher, the preacher, is to go beyond that, to also ask the question, what is the significance for the hearer, for our hearers? What should my listeners do in response to the passage? Okay, my job as a pastor, as a teacher, is not just to tell them what it says, but then to call them to respond and then help them respond. All right. We talked about this last time we met. I believe Paul is saying this when he mentions in 2 Timothy 4:2 to preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and then he said exhort with great patience. And that word exhort parakaleo, right? Is to come alongside. Holy Spirit is called the paraclete, or in John chapter 14 and 15, he's the one who comes alongside us, okay, to help us. And so the task of preaching, again, is that we need to call the hearers to respond and then also help them in how to respond. I think that's this idea of exhort, to come alongside our hearers, our congregation, those whom we're teaching, and to help them apply this particular passage. And we see an example of this from Paul in 1 Corinthians 10. I'm going to ask if a few of you guys can help read here. Zhao Li, can you read verses 1 to 6 here? And then Fu Wei, I'm going to ask if you can read verses 7 through 12. It's 1 Corinthians 10 here.
Okay. 1 to 6. For I do not want you to be unaware, brother, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, this thing took place as example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did.
Okay. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose out to pray. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, this thing happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instructions, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let everyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall.
All right, thank you so much. And notice I highlighted here a couple of statements Paul made as he is talking about events that took place with the Israelites in the wilderness, right? Now, who is his audience here, by the way, Paul? Who is he speaking to or writing to here? All right, we see it in the title of the letter, right? The Corinthians. Who are the Corinthians? What nation is Corinth in? Right? Is it in Israel? No, this is in Greece, right? This is a mainly Gentile congregation, not Jewish. Okay, that's important to remember. And here, Paul is looking back to the Old Testament, to the time when the people of Israel were in the wilderness, right? And they didn't show faith, they were rebellious. And so Paul brings up an example from, in that time. He mentions when they were in the wilderness, he says, most of them God was not pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. And then notice what he says. These things, what things? What was written about the people of Israel in the wilderness, these things took place as examples for us. All right. And then again, he gives a couple of specific examples of their rebellion. Again, speaking of the Israelites in the wilderness in the days of Moses. So this is, 1,500 years earlier in the land or among people of Israel. And notice verse 11, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the age has come. Therefore, so in response to this, so I find this very interesting. Paul here, speaking to a group of Gentile believers primarily, goes back to the Old Testament and says, look, God wrote this story down not only for the original hearers, but also for us. This applies to us. This was written for our instruction. So he gives here some specific ways or example here in 1 Corinthians 10. This is an example illustrating the importance of applying applying the scriptures. All right, that when we look at a passage of scripture, we need to see that passage is also meant to apply to us. And so Paul is presuming that with what happened to people of Israel, that what is written about them in the Exodus and Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, that too also was written for the instruction of the present day believer, by the way, as well, the Christian. Okay, so we can then assume, based on the same principle, that what Paul is writing here to the Corinthians applies to us today. It was written not only for their instruction, also for ours. Okay, and so in this, we can't forget, and this goes back to what Jesus was just telling the people in Matthew after the Sermon on the Mount, that God expects us to do something in response to his word, to not be the foolish man who builds his house on the sand, but actually to apply what God says. And I think we're familiar with these various passages of scripture here. Maybe I can ask a couple of you guys to read this. James 1:22. Be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Of course, we know that passage. John Sheng, if you're there, can you read the next passage here, Luke 6?
Yes.
Thank you.
Luke 6, verse 46 to 47. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my word and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock.
So parallel passage in Luke to what Jesus had said in Matthew. Can you read the next two as well? Luke 11.
Sure. Luke chapter 11, verse 28. But he said, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it. John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments.
Okay. Notice the word keep there. Obey, respond. So again, this is just reinforcing what I've been talking about the last several minutes of God's expectation that we not only hear and listen, but also to respond, to do something in response to it, to act upon what he says. And so this is where application then becomes important. It is the way in which we act, the way in which we respond. And so I believe as preachers, we need to be helpful to our hearers in guiding and directing them in that way. Here's an important, I think, a helpful remark by Brian Chappell. Dwayne, could you read this for us? Here, this remark by Brian Chappell. Oh, you're still muted, brother. Can you unmute, Dwayne? Can't hear you.
Not one to go off. There it went off.
There we go.
Okay.
All right.
Application fulfills the obligations of exposition. Application is the present personal consequence of scriptural truth. Without application, a preacher has no reason to preach, because truth without actual or potential application fulfills no redemptive purpose. This means that at its heart, preaching is not merely the proclamation of truth, but the application or applied. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Truth applied.
Truth applied. All right. Again, that just goes to what Jesus expressed in his expectation, not just hearing, but also responding. And so what does that mean, though? What does this look like? Well, that's where I want to spend the rest of our time considering what application is. So first, I want to talk about some of the guidelines for application. All right, and then we'll talk about some of the cautions as well that we need to be careful of. But application, right, should flow from authorial intent and can be identified. These are some questions just to consider. So as you're thinking about, okay, you've studied the passage, you're putting together your sermon, you've stated your point, as you're putting your sermon together, you've written down the explanation of that point and illustration, and now you're thinking about application. Well, these are some questions to consider as you are thinking about ways to apply the passage, not only to your own life, but also to your hearers. So just ask yourself, okay, from this particular point in the text, is there any thinking that needs to change? Are there any specific commands to obey from the passage? Any examples, right? Any sins need to be confessed? So these are just some general questions for you to consider as you're thinking about potential application from the passage. And again, I do some of this when I'm meditating on the passage, as I'm thinking about how it applies to me. Just these are some questions that I consider for myself as I'm considering application. And oftentimes, as I think about the ways that it applies to me and things that the Lord shows me, that sometimes comes out in my sermons, because those often are ways that those that I'm preaching to can apply the passage, right? So these are just some example questions to consider as you think about application of the passage for your hearers, okay? So these are just questions to consider. Another helpful guideline is, remember, application needs to distinguish between commands to a specific audience and those which are universal, all right? So I don't remember, I think we may have talked about this example before, but when you're in the passage, be careful that you don't make the application of the passage the same as your hearers, because it may not, there may not be that connection all the time. It depends on the situation. So in this example, Deuteronomy, this was a cultural application of how to show care for the safety of your neighbor, and love for your neighbor is to build this fence on the roof of your house so that no one falls off of it. But in other cultures, this would not be an application. Like here in the US, most houses are built with an A-frame. Nobody goes up on the roof. And so it wouldn't make sense to build a fence on a roof here. But there are other things we can do to be concerned for the safety and welfare and care for our neighbors. There are other things we can consider. So just be careful as you think about application. Don't just automatically take the application from the text, because it may or may not apply to your hearers. Now, the timeless truth here is, the timeless truth would be care or concern for the safety of our neighbor. And even more, timeless truth is to love your neighbor as yourself. All right, and one way to show that is to be concerned for their safety, protection. And so there are many ways that could apply. So if you were teaching this passage, you wouldn't then command people to, so thou shalt build a fence on your house. So get up on your roof right now, brothers and sisters, and build that fence, or you're in sin, right? That's not necessarily a right application for your hearers. Now, it was in the days of Moses, but for us, it would be, you would help your people to think about, okay, here we see an example of how to show love and concern and care for our neighbor. What are some ways that you can do that? Maybe if your hearers live in an apartment, how can you maybe give them some ideas of ways they can show love for their neighbors in their apartment, or things like that. All right. So just make sure that you distinguish between a command or application given to a specific audience and those which are universally given. Another example we've considered or talked about is circumcision in Galatians. When Paul spoke against it, he wasn't speaking against the act of circumcision. He was speaking against the reason they were being circumcised. Right? He wasn't saying circumcision is always bad. There are, health reasons that might be okay to do. But what he was saying was why they were getting circumcised was because it was to keep the law of Moses. And so that was the timeless truth is don't use works as a way to be saved or sanctified. Don't rely on works. And so that can be applied very differently in different situations. But in the case of the Galatians, the specific application was circumcision. Don't be circumcised then, Paul said. All right, so just pay attention there when you're thinking of application. As you're looking at the text, making sure, don't assume the same application in the passage is the one for my hearers. Now often it can be. There are many passages where the same application would apply to your hearers as well. Okay. Also, application should distinguish between what the Bible records and what the Bible approves. Now, what do I mean by that? Just because something is written down and describing an event doesn't mean that that's what is being prescribed. Let me give you an example here. Pastor Philip, can you read this passage from 1 Chronicles chapter 4?
Verses 9, 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm, so that it might not bring me pain. And God granted what he asked.
Okay, this is known as the prayer of Jabez. It's just a couple of verses that is actually buried in the genealogy in 1 Chronicles. And many have used this passage. There's a very famous book that was written to say that we must ask for the same blessing and that God will grant it because he did that for Jabez. So you're not experiencing God's blessing in your life because you're not asking. So here's a specific prayer you need to pray in order to receive that blessing. And then we'll go on and on. And now, we have to be careful. Just because something happened, again, this is in a narrative, okay? It's in a genealogy. And in that genealogy, the author chose to describe this particular event in the life of Jabez. And just because it happened doesn't mean that that's the way it would always happen. There's a difference between describing something, just saying what took place, and prescribing, telling what someone needs to do. Now here, this is a description. It's just telling what happened in this man Jabez's life, that he prayed this prayer and God granted it, which is great. Certainly, we can pray, and we can pray this kind of prayer as well, but we have to be careful that we don't make this a formula and say, well, you pray this prayer and God will respond in the same way, just like he did with Jabez. Well, maybe not. Okay, this passage is not prescribing that we pray this way and God will answer. It's just describing what Jabez did and what God did in response. Okay, so we have to understand how this fits into the author's intention as he's describing the genealogy. And that's where we'll understand the timeless truth that the author's trying to tell us. All right, so just keep that in mind as you think about application. Don't assume that everything that's happened in the Bible is something that that's going to always happen that way. Okay, especially if you're in narratives. Just because God did something a certain way in the past doesn't mean he will always do it that way in the future. Now, it depends what we're talking about, but just because God blessed or made a promise to a certain person in the past doesn't mean that that applies to us as well. It could, but we have to understand the whole passage and the context in order to know if that is the case or not. I think we talked about this, an example like Jeremiah 29 in the past, where it said, God says, I know the plans I have for you, plans to bless and prosper you, not for harm. And people use that as a promise of God for all people for all time. And it wasn't. It was given to the people of Judah in the exile as a promise to them that God would deliver them. Okay, but it's not a universal promise for every person, every situation, all time. There were many times God did not deliver. He didn't deliver Jesus from the cross, right? Job was not delivered for a while anyway from his pain, and he still lost those 10 children. They never were, God didn't raise those children back from the dead. We see many examples in Scripture of God's people suffering and God not delivering them. So that promise in Jeremiah was given to a specific people at a specific time. We can't make that a universal application for everybody. So that's why we have to study the passage and understand the setting and the background and all the context to know, okay, does this apply to us as well, or is it just for that people in that time? All right, so we have to keep that in mind as we're considering application from a passage. All right. Any questions so far on this? We don't mean to rush. Anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts?
So, Pastor Tim, I have a question. So how do you distinguish between the description and prescription? Oh, right. Description, you just said, description and
Prescription.
Oh, yeah, prescription, please.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I think the way to distinguish is a couple of things. First is, and we're going to talk about this when we go into narratives. The next module, we're talking about narratives. Narratives are stories. The Bible's majority of the Bible, more than half the Bible is narrative. And in a story, It's describing events that take place. And so if you're in a story, if you're studying a story, keep that in mind. Everything that's written there is describing events that took place. Now, the author has a reason in telling us this story. There is something he wants to prescribe for us, just like the parables, right? The parable was a story. So if you look at, say, what would be a good example? You know, the Good Samaritan. Right? He describes their story of a man who's robbed and, you know, left on the side of the road, and how a priest goes by, a Levite goes by, a Samaritan goes by. And so people might take that story and they start making application of, what the Samaritan did, so that basically they'll say, okay, every person in need, you must help them. You must put them up in a hotel and feed them. And so they make that the application. Now, was that the main point of the story? That's what you want to ask yourself. Do I apply what was written in the story? Those are just describing events. But Jesus had a point to that story, didn't he? Point was, love your neighbor as yourself. And this is what that looks like. It's to care for the needs of your neighbor, not to go out and find everybody on the street and give them money. All right, that could be a way to show love, but that's not what Jesus was commanding his hearers to do. He was just telling a story about a man who was robbed, and the one person that showed him love was this Samaritan. And so his point was, this is what love your neighbor looks like. And so, or his real point was, you need to be that neighbor like the Samaritan. And so, but he was telling the story to make that point. He wasn't telling the story to show exactly what you're to do all the time. Okay, how do we know that? Because it's a story. So we have to understand, what was the point of the story? That's where the prescription is. That's where the thing we need to apply. All right, not everything that happened in the story. Another example, right? He talks about the steward who, remember, he was going to lose his job. And so he goes to a bunch of his master's debtors and he reduces their debt. Remember that? He went to one guy and this guy owed him, I forget, 100 shekels. And he says, okay, pay 50. Well, he was robbing his master because he was going around telling these people they didn't owe as much. Hey, just pay this amount. So is that what Jesus says we need to do? If you have debt, just pay half of it. That's what Jesus told a story about a man who did that. Well, no, that's not the point. Jesus was just describing a person in the world who's wise, and he was making a comparison of we need to be wise as well. But he didn't mean to do that. Or remember the story when Peter, they need to pay their temple tax. And so Jesus said, go fishing. And so Peter catches a fish and he opens up the fish, and what's inside? Right? The 2 drachma or whatever. So is that passage teaching us, okay, if you need to pay your taxes, go fishing? I mean, that'd be great, right? That's all we had to do. Well, for some of us aren't very good fishermen, so we would be in trouble. But that passage wasn't teaching us, to pay your taxes, go fishing, find money in a fish, right? Just because it happened that way, it's not a prescription. It's not telling us that's the way it will always happen or that's what you must do. There was a point. It was describing events that took place. And so our goal, and again, we'll talk about this with narrative and how to do this, but our goal is to find out what was the point of that story. Why did the author tell us that story? Okay? Does that make sense, Pastor Philip? Description?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, that helps me a lot. Yeah.
So that's
Thank
the
you.
big, probably one of the biggest errors in teaching narrative that I've seen is people just take, because these events happen in this story, that's the application. Well, no, not necessarily. We need to be careful with that. And that's hard. That's what makes narratives difficult. But also, too, even in non-narrative passages, like I mentioned in Galatians, the application there was for them was for not to be circumcised, but that's not universal to everybody. That was in that specific situation. So we need to just keep that in mind. But yeah, especially when you're teaching from stories, be very careful about application. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's a good question. And again, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the next module. I'll give you more examples as well. But the idea is simply this: just because something happened doesn't mean it's the way it will or should always happen. All right, it could be, but don't assume that as you consider application. Another is, application. I know a lot of times preachers may wait till the very end of the message to give application, and certainly that's fine. It's not wrong to do. I think a better way to do that is to give application throughout the message. With each outline point that you make, try to think of an application or two within that point, because it is closer to the point, and you can more directly connect it to a particular point in your message. But it's certainly fine if you wait till the end to give some application. That's okay. I just think it would be better to do it along the way. Okay, for a couple reasons. One, again, one reason would be then the application is given closer to the point you are making. But also, too, sometimes if you run out of time, you may not get to the application. So if you wait till the end to give the application, then there might be times where you just, I have to end the message. So you don't give any application because you need to finish the sermon. And so I think that's why it's better to consider giving application along the way. Okay? All right. Now, here's one. I know some of you guys are tired. Just stay with me, because this, we'll finish up on this point. But this is, I think, for me, one of the most important points. Is this one: as we consider guidelines for application, the application should be suited to your hearers. All right. So keep this in mind as you're thinking about how a passage may apply, and as you come up with ideas, you need to think about, who am I speaking to here? Okay. And if all the group is the same, like maybe if you're speaking to a group of youth, then you can more focus your application, right? You can focus on what would be important for the young people. Or if you're speaking to a group of men or a group of women or older folks, or now if it's a mixed group, then we have, our applications will be more general. But if it's a more specific group, then you can direct the application more into their direction. So keep that in mind. Now, the most important question, though, is this: what is the spiritual condition of the hearers? Okay. Now, there's the broader question: are they saved or not? We'll talk about that in a minute. But here's a passage I found very, very helpful when I consider application, and it's in 1 Thessalonians 5:14. All right. This is a guiding passage for me as I consider application. 1 Thessalonians 5:14. Kaptuk, could you read this passage for us? 1 Thessalonians 5:14.
We urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone.
Great. Thank you. A short passage, but one that I think provides very helpful insight into our hearers. Because notice here, Paul basically summarizes the spiritual condition of people in a congregation into these three categories. He talks about the unruly. Okay, those are the ones that we might say are, unwilling to respond. Unruly has the idea of rebellious. They don't want to do it. Okay. And how does Paul say that those people should be addressed? He says, admonish them. Okay, so if there's anyone that's unruly, you need to admonish them. You need to warn them. You need to instruct them. You need to exhort them. All right? Because their heart is not willing to respond. Then you have, he says, the faint-hearted. Okay, those are the people who are basically discouraged. Life has been difficult. They're just down. They're discouraged. Maybe despairing. So what does he say to do to them? He doesn't say rebuke them or admonish them. He says encourage. They need to be encouraged, right? So the unruly, they need to be admonished. Like I said, rebuked, exhorted. The faint-hearted, they need to be encouraged, okay? And then he mentions a third category, the weak. Who are they? Those are the immature, the ignorant. They may not know a particular truth, or they're young in the faith. So there's immaturity. What does he say to do for them? He says, help them. Okay. So notice here, Paul gives sort of three general categories of people. All right. You're going to have those who may be at a place where they're unruly. They're just unwilling to respond or obey. You're going to have those who are faint-hearted. They're just discouraged. They're going through a trial in their life or difficulty, and they're struggling. Or you'll have the weak, those who just don't know better, or they're immature, or they just need more understanding. Okay? And he has a different way to deal with each category. So think about this as you're preaching. You're going to have those in your congregation that are unruly. Okay? Those that maybe they're at a place in their life where they're just like, they're just not really receptive or willing to respond rightly. And they need to be admonished. There may be those in your congregation who are sinning at that point, and they need to be exhorted, okay, warned. But keep in mind, in that same congregation, you're going to have people who are discouraged, okay, where they don't need to be rebuked. They need to be encouraged. And you're also going to have people in your congregation who are just immature, ignorant. They need to be given instruction and shown what to do. All right. And so we have to be careful. I think in your sermons, in your teachings, you need to consider all three categories of people as you think about application. Don't preach to everybody as if they're all unruly. Okay. Because some of them may just be discouraged or immature. And don't preach to everyone assuming they're just all discouraged. Some of them just are being unruly. They don't want to obey. Okay. So I think Paul here is very helpful, and he gives us these three categories of believer, of other people within the congregation. And I think as a preacher, that's very helpful to consider as you're thinking about application. So think about application. How might this text apply to someone who's unruly? What should I say? How would this text apply to someone who's discouraged? How can I help them? How can I help someone who's just immature or ignorant or doesn't have the understanding? All right. So keep that in mind. Notice Paul adds to this, be patient with everyone. Okay. All right. Everybody we need to be patient with, but specifically if a person's unruly, they need to be admonished. If they're faint-hearted, they need to be encouraged. If they're weak, immature, they need to be helped. All right. I found this very, very helpful. So as I consider an application, as I've putting a sermon together, as I have the point written, I have the explanation written out, I've written out an illustration. As I think about application, then I step back and think, okay, how would this apply to somebody who is responding sinfully? What would I say to them? If you're talking about prayer, right? You say, now some of you just aren't praying. Some of you have not made it a habit in your life to pray. You need to, and then I would exhort them. Now, I might also then say, now some of you want to pray. You know it's important. You're weary. You're struggling. You're going through difficulties in life, and it's just hard for you to pray. Well, I would then give them a different application, wouldn't I? I wouldn't scold them. They're discouraged. They're struggling. Now, there may be others who I might then add another type of application. Now, some of you want to pray. You're trying to pray. You just don't know how. You don't know what you should pray. Well, that's the weak. That's the immature. So then you give them instruction, application to help them know how to pray. Do you understand the differences I'm making here? Okay. There's, we need to keep that in mind, because I think a lot of us, when we teach, we sort of assume a certain category of people we're preaching to. I know preachers that they just assume everybody's unruly. So they're always, scolding the hearers. And so there are those in their congregation who are discouraged that rebuking just makes them more discouraged. It doesn't help them. And then I know some preachers who more focus on people who are discouraged. So they're always trying to be encouraging, and that's great. But there's some people in their congregation who are unruly, and they need to be rebuked. So we need to keep in mind all three of these categories, if you will. So not just maybe age and if they're married or single, or if they're, what cultural background, those are important. But here Paul gives sort of the three spiritual categories that we should keep in mind as preachers of those in our congregation, because that's the most important, is their spiritual condition. And we need to, as we think of application, address that. So like I said, you might say, now some of you aren't applying this passage, or some of you have disobeyed in this area, and you need to, and so you would, but others, they just may be struggling, and they need to be encouraged. Okay, now some passages are more focused on one category or another. Pastor Philip, you had a question?
Yes, I do. Yeah. According to 1 Thessalonians 5:14, for those who are unruly, so admonishing or rebuking is from the pulpit or very personal one?
Yeah, now this passage is specific to personal interaction between believers. Each believer coming alongside a brother or sister. Okay, I'm saying that what Paul describes here, though, is he's describing three categories of people in the congregation. So I'm just saying, as a preacher, that's a helpful insight. then? That Paul sort of summarizes these three categories of people in the church. There are people in the church who are unruly at times. There are people in the church who are discouraged, faint-hearted. There are those in the church who are weak, immature. And so as a brother, you come alongside these people, and this is how you should respond. As you're talking to a brother and you realize he's in sin, you need to admonish him. Or you're talking to a brother or sister and they're discouraged, we should encourage them. If you're talking with a brother or sister who's weak or immature, ignorant of truth, then we need to help them. All right. So yeah, that's the specific thing Paul's saying here. And I'm just saying that Paul has, in giving that instruction, he's actually helped the preacher too, because he's identified three categories of people in the church. And so it's good for us to know that as we are teaching or preaching, that the people out listening to me are in one of those three categories at that point in time. And that can change too, right? Sometimes for us, right? Some days or weeks we're discouraged, others we're unruly. And other times we're just weak or immature, or we don't know better. So I think that's what so this passage is not given to preachers, it's given to believers and how they should treat one another, but it's a helpful insight for preachers as they think about the spiritual condition of those in the congregation. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah. So my parents' generation, yeah, rebuking from the pulpit in the congregation happened. But my generation, no rebuke, both from the pulpit and even the individually or privately. Myself, most pastor, or maybe I must say all pastor I have met, and myself, we never do the rebuking privately or publicly. No church discipline. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very challenging.
Yeah, and that I think is a great point. We see that where there's just sort of one focus from the pulpit oftentimes. And so we have to remember there's a mixture of people. So when I get toward like I said in my sermon, as I'm writing it out, I ask myself, okay, have I considered these three categories of people in my application, in my message? And I think that's important because all of us will have a particular, some of us are more focused on the weak. So we give a lot of instruction. So our focus is, just giving instruction, teaching. Some of us, we focus more on the unruly. So we're more exhorting and rebuking in our messages. And then some of us focus on the discouraged. We assume everybody's discouraged. And so we just focus on being encouraging. And what can happen over time, though, if you do that, if you just do encouragement in your messages, then those who are unruly will get worse, right? Because you're not talking to them. And it can go the other way. If all the time you're rebuking or exhorting, then people who are discouraged will get more discouraged and get worse. So what happens is if you don't address each of these groups, then that group gets worse. If you don't rebuke the unruly, they just get more unruly, potentially. If you don't help the weak, they just continue and get more weak, more immature, more ignorant. And yeah, if you don't encourage the discouraged, they get more discouraged usually. So So that's why I really found this a lot of wisdom in this passage from Paul, not only in how to treat fellow believers, that's the primary focus, but then also as a preacher, how that helps me to know how to address the congregation better. And just assume there's going to be people in each of these categories as I'm preaching. Okay, one more thought, and then we'll finish for today related to this, and that is, as we think about our hearers, not only consider the three categories, but also more broadly, in every sermon, always preach the gospel. Amen, Dwayne? At some point in your message, preach the gospel. Never assume, for a couple reasons. One, never assume that everybody listening to you is a believer. And never assume that everyone's walking with Christ. So we all need the gospel, not just for salvation. We need the gospel for our sanctification as well. And that's what's interesting in 2 Timothy chapter 4. If you remember, Paul exhorts Timothy, preach the word, right? In season, out of season, rebuke, exhort. And then he gives him another instruction, do the work of an evangelist. And I think in the context there, he's speaking of his preaching ministry primarily, but also as a pastor. But I think that's a helpful reminder for us that we must always bring the gospel into our messages. One, because there most likely is a non-believer or non-believers who are listening. And two is that the gospel, as Paul said in Romans 1, that he was eager to preach the gospel to those who believe, because the gospel truths are also so helpful and important for believers as well. But always preach the gospel. You know, at our church, it's kind of interesting. My father-in-law, or I'm sorry, my son-in-law's father. So my wife's husband, his father, we went to the same church for many years, and he went there many, many years, and he thought he was a Christian. All right. And as he tells his testimony, you know, he's coming, and then the preacher kept preaching the gospel every week. Okay, that was just part of, he knew that, you know, people need to hear the gospel. So my son-in-law's dad, he would say, why does this guy keep doing that? Doesn't he know everybody's a Christian here? Why does he keep preaching the gospel? Well, one day he's thinking about it, and he says, you know what? I'm not a Christian. As he was hearing the gospel preached over and over and over, he realized he wasn't really saved. And so even though he had been going to the church for years, and his wife was a believer, and you know, he'd been involved in church, he realized he didn't really know Christ. And so, and I hear this over and over and over. I had many people when I was preaching every week, you know, many people would come and say they'd been coming to the church for years, and something in the message as the gospel was preached, they realized they weren't a Christian. So I think, you know, that's something just keep in mind. So for your sermon, as you write out your sermon, you know, the two things you want to ask yourself: one, have I addressed the unruly, the faint-hearted, and the weak? And two, have I preached the gospel? Where's the gospel here? And try to connect it to an appropriate place in your sermon. You don't always have to save it till the very end and have people, you know, raise their hand and all that. You can preach it at the end, that's fine, but I like to find a point within the message that it connects to. So say, for example, you're doing that message on prayer, and you're speaking about prayer, and you're not saying, some of you, maybe you find it hard to pray. And for years and years, you just struggled to pray. You ask yourself, why is that? Well, maybe for some of you, maybe it's that you don't really know the Lord, and you don't want to pray because you're really not his child. So for some of you, you really might need to think about, do I know Christ? And then I would give a gospel presentation at that point. So try to connect it at an appropriate place within your message, where it will be most effective to that. Or so, okay, covered a lot of stuff here. Any final thoughts or questions about that before we retire for the evening? Those last 2 points are really the most important of everything we've talked about tonight. You know, as you consider application, consider the 3 categories of people, and then also remember the fact that we need to always bring the gospel into our message. Anybody have any last thoughts or comments or questions? Okay, I will take that as my hint to finish, be done, let you guys get some rest. We will, Lord willing, the plan is to meet next week. By the way, I don't go to Pakistan until Thursday of next week. So we'll gather together next Tuesday and continue going through. And then we'll have a few weeks off. Following that, while I'm in Pakistan, I won't be able to access the internet very easily. So that will give you some time if you want to work on some of the assignments. I have caught up. I'm very, very sorry. I was very delinquent and delayed in giving you feedback on the assignments, those of you that have turned them in. But I believe I've done everything, caught up. So any assignment you've turned in, you should have been there. I gave feedback. I'll talk more next week. If some of you want to put a sermon together and be evaluated, I'll talk about that next week. And then you'll have some time to prepare for that if you would like to do that. So I'll talk more about that when we gather. So Lord willing, I'll see you guys here at the same time next Tuesday night, and we'll continue. All right. Pastor Dwayne, would you bring us before the Lord in prayer?